Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here on our annual post-budget event, the Budget Verdict. This is CNBC TV 18's effort to try and get the budget makers, the budget architects to interact with the industry in their very first interaction post-delivering the union budget. It is my honor and privilege to invite on stage the Revenue Secretary, Sanjay Malhotra, to please join us here for the Budget Verdict. Mr. Malhotra, thank you very much for joining us. The number one question, and I think this is something that came up periodically through the conversations that we had. One, of course, as far as tax collections are concerned, the government has been able to over-deliver on the estimates that were put forward in the budget last year. But the larger issue and the larger question that people are posing at this point in time is why this conservatism as far as tax collections are concerned, and when can we actually expect the government to do better, especially in the context of a higher tax to GDP ratio?
No, I'm surprised. I would like to dispel the notion insofar as the budget estimates for the next year are concerned. Let me assure all of you that the numbers that we have put forth are very much in line with the GDP numbers. So the GDP is estimated from a budget perspective to grow nominally at 10.5%. And you yourself mentioned that our tax to GDP ratio has been constant.
Yeah.
And so is it not realistic to assume that the tax to GDP ratio will not change dramatically and remain the same? And so in line with that, the revenue projections for this next year are also at 10.5%. So they are very much realistic. You are aware that these depend primarily on three things. One, the GDP, how the GDP does. If it does better, then then the tax revenues should also be more. And if it doesn't do as well, then it will be lower. The second thing it depends is on the rates. And we haven't factored in, I may tell all of you, we have not factored in the relief that we have given, of about 37,000 crore on the direct taxes side. Indirect taxes is, of course, very less. But I would like to inform all of you that when we did the budget estimates for next year, the relief on the personal income tax has not been yet factored in. So in fact, if anything, it's an overestimate. Thirdly, it depends on collection efficiency, and that's what gives the buoyancy, right? Either through the tax rate or through the collection efficiency. So we have assumed, right now we have assumed 100%, But yes, we have done well in this year, particularly we have done well this year. And there are a number of areas where we have tried to plug loopholes to broaden the tax base, to deepen the tax base. And so yes, there is some room, but let's see, from a budget perspective, I think it's a realistic estimate. It's certainly not a conservative estimate.
Now, there has been a long pending demand on rate rationalization as far as GST is concerned. That's not a budget item, but it is going to be something that perhaps the government will now look at the budget exercise being over and done with. On this issue as far as what is the GST rate and what the real revenue neutral rate is and how the two shall meet, what is the way forward?
No, so that's an interesting question, but let me tell you that the revenue neutral, let me remind all of us here that when GST was being implemented, at that time the revenue neutral rate was thought to be about 15.4%. Yes. But actual practice experience tells us that in practice over the last 65 months, we have data for 65 months since it was implemented, and the actual effective rate has only been about 11.5%, so which means 3.9% lower. And despite that, you have seen that there is good buoyancy. We have done better insofar as GST is concerned. We have done better than the growth rates in GDP over there.
Joining me now on stage is the DPAM Secretary, Tuhin Kanta Pandey. Mr. Pandey, many thanks for joining us here on CNBC TV 18. Before I get to you about next year's target and next year's aspiration, let's talk about this financial year. How do you intend to close the gap?
This financial year, we have a target of about 1.0 lakh crore, 1.05 lakh crore if you count disinvestments as well as the dividend from CPSEs. And we have done about 68,000 crore yet, about 60, I mean, close to 70%, about 70%. And, usually on the dividend side, we have been exceeding. In the last year, we had a dividend target of 46,000 crore and we ended up with 59,000 crore. Because we had certain, headwinds this year. But nevertheless, I think we would do it better than our target there. And on disinvestment, we will continue our, we will continue to strive to meet the target within the market conditions that we get in next 2 months.
You're smiling while you're saying that you'll continue to strive to meet the target, but what could you depend on? Could you depend on the likes of Hindustan Zinc, for instance, to be able to close the gap on the disinvestment side? Dividend, I understand, and you pointed that out quite eloquently, that you've been able to exceed, but on disinvestment, that's where the problem is. So could a Hindustan Zinc-like option come to the rescue to close the gap?
Well, I don't think that we really specifically, at least in those cases where we do minority stake sale, we really don't reveal the names and the numbers. And you know that certain SEBI norms are there, certain things are there where we don't, this thing is there. But certainly we had two pillars. One is the minority stake sale and the other one is the privatization, where we do what we call also strategic disinvestment. And put together, we have to look at different conditions and different stocks and look at, particularly looking into the interest of the minority shareholders and then act accordingly.
And for the benefit of this audience also, let's understand, because so much was made about disinvestment, strategic disinvestment, privatization. What should we now expect as the run rate to really realistically be?
I think let me also tell that, these last 3 years is precisely the years when we had major issues just after the budget announcements. We have, for the first year, we had COVID. And the second year, we had, the Delta wave. And then third, we had Omicron and Ukraine crisis and the Fed and the others where, the sentiment of markets completely changed. We had also some of those big ticket disinvestments, for example, BPCL, where we proceeded well, but in between they were caught up in the energy transition issues, also the transition of geopolitical issues on fuel. And then obviously the bidders didn't want to proceed further, and we had to call off that EOI.
It's time for me to welcome to our cast of stars here on stage, the Chief Economic Advisor, Anantha Nageshwaran. Mr. Nageshwaran, if you could join us here on stage, please. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for the Chief Economic Advisor, Anantha Nageshwaran. Mr. Nageshwaran, many thanks for joining us. Before I talk to you about the domestic factors, let's talk about the changes that have happened overnight globally. And let me begin by asking you about what you make of the commentary that's come in from the Fed Chief Jerome Powell, stating that perhaps the first signs of a disinflationary environment. How comfortable does that make you feel, especially in light of the global uncertainties that we are faced with?
Of course, did mention the fact that temporarily, or at least for now, inflation pressures have eased. But he also mentioned that they are very determined to reach their 2% target, and they are committed to further rate increases. But the financial markets took a different view of his press conference. So that is what bothers me, because financial markets, having been conditioned over 2 to 3 decades in a different manner, or are refusing to believe that this Fed would want to see the inflation rate come down even further and would be poised to tighten. So the more they kind of engage in this eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation with the Fed and expects the Fed to blink first, and if the Fed doesn't, then the amount of rate hikes that will be required will become even more than what would be the case otherwise. That is what bothers me from the emerging market and the Indian angle.
And which is why you talked about entrenched inflation and the possibility of a longer tightening cycle as well in the economic survey. But that's one of the global factors. The other global factor that I want you to comment on, and I don't think that we've discussed that enough, especially since we've been poring over the budget, is the impact of what's happening in China. The reopening, bouncing back as far as manufacturing is concerned, the PMI in China coming back to about 50, under that is of course contraction. The implications of China reopening in the way that it has on the global economy and what it eventually will mean for India as well.
So obviously, given the size of Chinese economy, whatever happens there will have a global impact, whether it's a slowdown or an expansion. And to the extent that if the recovery happens to be smoother, then definitely it would have it would impart an upward pressure on commodity prices. Including it will create a higher demand for crude oil. So therefore, we have to factor that into our calculations going forward in 23-24. So the speed with which Chinese economy returns to normal and the magnitude of the bounce from last year's growth rates will definitely have a material impact from the point of view of global inflation and from the point of view of commodity prices. So in fact, it could even prolong the monetary tightening cycle in the Western advanced economies. So that is something we need to watch.
Let me also take the opportunity to welcome on stage the Economic Affairs Secretary, Ajay Sheth. Mr. Sheth, could we have you join us on stage, please, as we take a question here from Rahul. A big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for the Economic Affairs Secretary. Go ahead, Rahul.
So I'm saying that what is the tax the economy of our size, economy of our kind should generate versus what's the tax that we actually collect? Is that reasonably converging, or is there a big gap or a small gap? How much is that gap, and what's the trend over the years on that gap?
Okay. If we can give an overall number, what we are collecting as an economy, I'm talking about center and states put together, is roughly about 17 to 18% of GDP is our tax effort. Certainly, it is on a rural size. If you look at just about the BRICS countries, only China has of this order. All other three countries have a much higher. And of course, advanced economies have 25% plus. And China is a different, much more controlled economy, or rather is a controlled economy. So we have to move to the path wherein first from 17, 18% we reach to 20% before we think of where we move further. And in the last couple of years, if we discount what happened during the pandemic, inching up like last year, getting 11% plus centers alone, tax to GDP ratio is a positive sign. And more automation, GST and direct tax simplification is moving to that direction. So yes, approach is more ratio, more people into the tax net, a moderate tax rate, that's the general approach.
But if you could explain the thinking and the rationale behind what we've seen happen specifically as far as the rural budget is concerned and why the decline?
It will not be a correct statement to say the rural budget has come down. Of one particular scheme is the MNRAGS, that allocation has come down, but that scheme is demand driven. People come for a wage employment because they don't have any other employment opportunity. And as we are seeing it, the economy is picking up, especially the services sector. There is a pull factor from urban areas, people migrating back to the urban areas, and they are getting the job opportunities there. But an equally important, what the fiscal is trying to do for rural housing, budget has gone up from 20,000 crore to close to 55,000 crore, 54,400 and plus crores. So increase of 170%. Who are the people who are going to construct? Machines are not going to construct. Those houses will be constructed by human beings. So there will be a job demand will be coming in. Similar manner for drinking water, rural drinking water, budget has gone up from 60,000 to 70,000. Of course, part of it will be material, but a significant part will as well be material, because that all has to be embedded below the earth. So these two significant increases which generates job or wage employment in the rural area more than compensate for what has been the reduction in terms of NNRGS, but that is based on assessment that demand for wage employment will be less in the coming year.
Gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much to the DPAM Secretary, to the Chief Economic Advisor, as well as to the Economic Affairs Secretary for joining us here on the CNBC TV 18 Budget Verdict. We appreciate your time, and thank you very much for joining us here with your insights.